Behind the towering gates of Kensington Palace, a small boy pressed his face against the cool window glass, watching ordinary children walk freely down the street with their backpacks bouncing against their shoulders. Prince George Alexander Louis, third in line to the British throne, had everything a child could dream of, except the one thing he wanted most: to be normal. Tomorrow would change everything. For the first time in his young life, George would step outside the protective bubble of royal protocol and enter a world where his last name meant nothing to his classmates. A world where he would have to earn friendship rather than inherit respect. A world where being shy wasn't a luxury a future monarch could afford. But what happens when centuries of royal tradition collide with the simple desire of a boy who just wants to fit in? This is the true story of how one extraordinary day transformed not just a prince, but everyone who witnessed the courage it takes to be authentically yourself in a world that expects you to be someone else. The soft chiming of Big Ben echoed across London as Prince George stirred in his bed at Kensington Palace. The morning light filtered through heavy curtains that had witnessed generations of royal awakenings, but today felt different. Today, 8-year-old George would face something no amount of royal training had prepared him for: being an ordinary schoolboy. George had been awake for nearly an hour, staring at the ceiling of his bedroom. Unlike other children who might have soccer posters or superhero decorations, his walls displayed centuries-old paintings of his ancestors. Kings and queens gazed down at him with stern expressions, as if reminding him of the weight of expectation that rested on his small shoulders. His new school uniform hung carefully on the wardrobe door. The crisp white shirt, navy blazer, and perfectly pressed trousers looked intimidating in the early morning light. This wasn't the formal attire he wore for state occasions or family portraits. This was meant to help him blend in, to be just another student walking through school corridors. The irony wasn't lost on him that even his attempt at normalcy had been orchestrated by a team of royal advisors. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, knocked gently on his door. "George, darling, it's time to get ready." Her voice carried that perfect balance of motherly warmth and royal composure that she had mastered over the years. When she entered, she found her eldest son sitting on the edge of his bed, his blonde hair tousled from a restless night's sleep. "I've been thinking, Mama," George said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if the other children don't like me? What if they think I'm strange because I live in a palace?" Catherine sat beside him on the bed, the same bed where she had read him countless bedtime stories about brave knights and adventurous princes. But today her son needed to hear a different kind of story, one about courage in the face of uncertainty. "Do you remember the story of your great-great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, when she was young?" Catherine asked, smoothing down a rebellious cowlick in George's hair. "She was terribly shy as a child. During the war, when she was about your age, she had to speak on the radio to children all across the Commonwealth. She was so nervous that her hands shook, but she did it anyway." George looked up at his mother with wide blue eyes, the same eyes that would one day gaze out from official portraits and currency. "Was she scared?" "Absolutely terrified," Catherine replied with a gentle smile. "But she learned something important that day. Being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means you do what's right even when you are afraid. And going to school, making friends, learning alongside other children, that's not just right for you, George. It's essential." Meanwhile, downstairs in the palace kitchen, the staff moved with military precision. Mrs. Jenkins, the head cook who had served the royal family for over 2 decades, prepared George's lunch with the same attention to detail she would give to a state banquet. But instead of delicate canapes and champagne, she carefully packed sandwiches cut into perfect triangles, fresh fruit, and a small bottle of water. "Mind you don't give the boy anything that might cause a fuss," she muttered to her assistant, Sarah. "No peanuts, nothing too exotic. We want him fitting in, not standing out because of his lunch." Sarah, who was young enough to remember her own school days, watched with amusement as Mrs. Jenkins fretted over whether to include an apple or an orange. "Mrs. Jenkins, it's just lunch. The boy needs to eat like any other child." "That's where you're wrong, dear," Mrs. Jenkins replied, adjusting her glasses as she examined the sandwich for any imperfection. "Prince George isn't just any other child. He carries the future of the monarchy in that school bag. Every detail matters. In another part of the palace, protection officers were conducting their final briefing. Detective Inspector James Morrison, George's primary bodyguard, reviewed the school layout for the 100th time. Unlike previous royal children who had attended boarding schools or been educated privately, George would be attending a local primary school in London. This presented unique challenges that hadn't been faced in generations. Remember, we maintain distance, Morrison addressed his team. The boy needs to feel normal, but we need to ensure his safety. We're ghosts, there but not there. His colleague, Detective Sergeant Emma Clark, nodded as she studied the photographs of George's new classmates. Each child had been thoroughly vetted, their families' backgrounds checked multiple times. What about playtime? Children can be unpredictable. We adapt, Morrison replied firmly. Our job is to let him be a child while keeping him safe. It's a delicate balance, but it's what the future king needs. Back in George's bedroom, the young prince was slowly getting dressed. Each piece of clothing felt like armor he was putting on for battle. The crisp white shirt felt stiff against his skin, so different from the comfortable clothes he wore around the palace. As he struggled with his tie, his younger sister, Charlotte, appeared in the doorway. "You look very smart, George," she said with the brutal honesty that only a younger sibling can possess, but also a bit scared. "Are you worried about making friends?" George paused in his fight with the tie. Charlotte, despite being younger, sometimes seemed to understand things that adults missed. What if they don't want to be friends with a prince? What if they think I'm too different? Charlotte skipped into the room and sat cross-legged on the floor, her princess dress spreading around her like flower petals. "Papa says that real friends like you for who you are inside, not for what you have outside. Maybe some children will want to be your friend just because you're a prince, but the best friends will want to be your friend because you're George." The wisdom from his 6-year-old sister struck George more powerfully than any advice from royal advisors. She was right, of course. The challenge wouldn't just be making friends, it would be figuring out who wanted to be friends with him for the right reasons. William, the Prince of Wales, knocked on the doorframe. "Ready for the big day, son?" His voice carried the kind of understanding that only comes from personal experience. William remembered his own first days at school, the mixture of excitement and terror that came with stepping into the unknown. "Papa, did you ever wish you weren't a prince?" George asked as his father helped him with his tie. William paused, considering his answer carefully. This was one of those moments that would shape his son's understanding of duty and privilege. Many times, he admitted, "But then I realized something important. Being a prince isn't about the title or the palaces or the ceremonies. It's about service. It's about using whatever gifts and opportunities you have to help other people." "But what does that have to do with going to school?" George asked, genuinely puzzled. "Everything," William replied, adjusting his son's collar. "How can you serve people you don't understand? How can you lead a nation if you've never sat in a classroom with children from different backgrounds, different families, different dreams? This isn't just about your education, George. It's about learning who you're meant to serve someday." As the family gathered for breakfast, the dining room buzzed with nervous energy. Even baby Louis seemed to sense that something important was happening, babbling more excitedly than usual from his high chair. The formal dining table, which usually hosted diplomats and heads of state, was set for a simple family breakfast. Catherine had insisted on maintaining some normalcy during this transition. Instead of having staff serve them, she poured orange juice and buttered toast herself. These small acts of ordinary parenting felt revolutionary within the walls of the palace. "Remember," she said to George as he picked at his scrambled eggs, "you don't need to tell anyone you're a prince on your first day. Let them get to know George first." "But won't they recognize me?" George asked. "My picture has been in newspapers." "Some might," William acknowledged. "But children often see what they expect to see. If you act like any other boy, many of them will just see any other boy." As breakfast concluded, the reality of the morning began to set in. George would soon leave the protective walls of the palace and enter a world where his every move wouldn't be carefully choreographed by protocol experts. He would have to navigate friendships, classroom dynamics, and playground politics without the safety net of royal privilege. Mrs. Patterson, George's longtime nanny, appeared with a school bag, already packed with everything he would need. Her eyes were slightly misty. She had cared for George since he was a baby, and this felt like watching him take his first steps all over again. "Now then, Your Royal Highness," she said then, caught herself. "I mean, George, remember to raise your hand if you need to ask a question, share your toys during playtime, and always say please and thank you." George hugged her tightly. Mrs. Patterson smelled like lavender, and home like all the bedtime stories and scrape-knee Band-Aids of his early childhood. Leaving her felt like leaving a piece of his security behind. The car arrived precisely on schedule. Not the usual royal convoy with multiple vehicles and motorcycle escorts, but a single modest car that could belong to any professional family in London. This had been carefully planned. George's arrival at school needed to be as normal as possible. As they drove through the streets of London, George pressed his face to the window and watched the city wake up. Office workers hurried along sidewalks with coffee cups and briefcases. Shop owners rolled up their shutters and swept their front steps. Children walked to school with their parents, chattering excitedly about their day ahead. This was the London that George was meant to serve someday, but had rarely seen up close. The real city, with its mixture of grand architecture and humble neighborhoods, its diversity of faces and languages, its rhythm of ordinary life that had nothing to do with royal ceremonies or state occasions. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Catherine observed, following her son's gaze. "All those people living their lives, pursuing their dreams, facing their challenges. Someday, you'll have the privilege of serving them all." George nodded solemnly, beginning to understand that this school experience was about much more than his personal education. It was about connecting with the people he would one day lead, understanding their hopes and fears, their daily struggles and simple joys. As they approached the school, George could see other children arriving with their parents. Some skipped excitedly toward the entrance, while others clung nervously to their mother's hands. He realized with a mixture of comfort and anxiety that he wasn't the only one facing something new and scary today. The car slowed as they reached the school gates. This was it, the moment when Prince George would become simply George, when centuries of royal tradition would meet the democratic chaos of a primary school classroom. As he gathered his courage for what lay ahead, George couldn't know that this day would not only change his own life, but would also transform the way the royal family connected with the British people. The door handle felt cold under his small hand as he prepared to step into his new world, carrying with him the hopes of his family, the weight of tradition, and the simple, powerful desire of any 8-year-old boy to find his place among friends. The iron gates of St. Thomas's Primary School had never seemed so imposing to anyone as they did to George that September morning. As the modest royal car pulled up to the curb, he could see dozens of children streaming through the entrance, their voices creating a symphony of excitement that was both thrilling and terrifying. Catherine squeezed his hand gently. "Remember, darling, you're not Prince George today. You're just George Wales." The use of their family surname felt strange on her lips. For most of his life, George had simply been His Royal Highness Prince George of Cambridge. But today he needed to be someone who could fit on a class register without causing a constitutional crisis. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, the headmistress, stood near the school entrance wearing a carefully composed smile that didn't quite hide her nervousness. She had been preparing for this day for months, coordinating with royal protection officers, briefing her staff, and tried to anticipate every possible scenario. In her 30 years as an educator, she had never faced a challenge quite like this. "Good morning, Your Royal High," she began then, caught herself with a slight flush. "Good morning, Mrs. Wales." "Good morning, George. We're so pleased to have you joining us." George looked up at the headmistress with wide eyes. She seemed kind, with graying hair pulled back in a sensible bun, and gentle wrinkles around her eyes that suggested she smiled often. But even her attempt at normalcy couldn't hide the fact that this was anything but an ordinary enrollment. "Thank you for having me," George replied politely, his royal training evident in his perfect posture and clear articulation. Several passing parents glanced over, perhaps recognizing something familiar about the well-dressed boy with impeccable manners. But Most were too focused on their own children's first-day anxieties to pay much attention. As they walked through the corridor toward George's classroom, the sounds of the school enveloped them. Children's laughter echoed from the playground. Teachers called out morning greetings, and the general bustle of 300 students beginning their day created an energy that was completely foreign to George's palace experience. The walls were covered with children's artwork, colorful displays about different countries, and photos from school events. George studied a particular display showing last year's sports day, fascinated by the casual joy on the children's faces as they participated in relay races and tug-of-war competitions. In his world, even recreational activities were carefully planned affairs with specific protocols and photographers documenting every moment. "Here we are, Mrs. Whitfield announced as they reached a door marked Class 3B, Miss Thompson. Through the window, George could see children hanging up their coats and settling at small tables arranged in groups of 4. His future classmates looked so natural, so comfortable in this environment that felt like another planet to him. Miss Sarah Thompson, George's teacher, emerged from the classroom with a kind of warm energy that immediately put nervous children at ease. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, with curly auburn hair and eyes that sparkled with genuine enthusiasm for her job. "You must be George," she said, extending her hand for a proper handshake rather than treating him like a small child. "I'm Miss Thompson, and I'm absolutely delighted you'll be joining our class. We've been preparing a special welcome for our new student." George shook her hand solemnly, impressed by her matter-of-fact approach. No curtsying, no excessive formality, just the kind of straightforward friendliness he had hoped for, but hadn't dared expect. "Now," Miss Thompson continued, "would you like to meet your classmates? They're very excited to have someone new join our little family." Catherine knelt down to George's level, smoothing his hair one last time. "Remember what we talked about, sweetheart. Be yourself, be kind, and have fun. Papa and I will be here to collect you at 3:30. The goodbye was harder than either of them had expected. For George, his mother represented security and familiarity in a world that was about to become completely unpredictable. For Catherine, this moment represented her eldest child's first real step toward independence, toward the life he would need to lead as a future king. As Catherine walked back down the corridor, Detective Inspector Morrison melted into the background, positioning himself where he could maintain visual contact with George's classroom while remaining invisible to the children inside. The other protection officers took up similarly discreet positions around the school perimeter. Miss Thompson led George into the classroom, where 28 children looked up from their morning activities with open curiosity. George felt his cheeks flush as all eyes turned toward him. In his palace life, attention was expected and carefully managed. Here it felt raw and unpredictable. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet our new classmate, George Wales," Miss Thompson announced. "He's just moved to London, and this is his first day with us. I know you'll all make him feel very welcome." A forest of hands shot up immediately. "Where did you move from? Do you like football? What's your favorite subject?" The questions came rapid fire, and George felt overwhelmed by the enthusiasm. One at a time, Miss Thompson laughed. "George, why don't you tell us a little about yourself?" George stood at the front of the classroom, acutely aware of his perfect posture and careful enunciation. "Hello, everyone. I'm George. I'm 8 years old, and I like aircraft and military history. I'm looking forward to making new friends here." A boy with messy brown hair and a gap-toothed grin raised his hand eagerly. "I'm Oliver, and I love planes too. Do you want to sit with us?" The simple invitation felt like a lifeline to George. He nodded gratefully and made his way to the table where Oliver sat with 2 other children, a girl with intricate braids named Amara and a quiet boy named James who was methodically organizing his pencils by color. "What's your favorite aircraft?" Oliver asked as George settled into the chair beside him. "The Typhoon," George replied, then caught himself. His knowledge of military aircraft came from private tours of RAF bases and conversations with Air Force commanders. "I saw one at an air show once," he added quickly. "Cool. My dad was in the RAF," Oliver said. "He says the Typhoon can go faster than the speed of sound. Is that true?" George nodded enthusiastically, grateful to find common ground. Yes, it can reach Mach 1.8, and it has delta wings and canards for enhanced maneuverability. Oliver's eyes widened with admiration, while Amara looked impressed despite herself. How do you know so much about planes? She asked. I, I read a lot, George replied, which was technically true even if his reading material included classified military briefings that most 8-year-olds would never see. Miss Thompson began the morning lessons with a geography session about different countries around the world. George found himself in the unusual position of sitting quietly while other children shared what they knew about various nations. In his royal education, he had studied diplomatic relations, trade agreements, and constitutional structures of Commonwealth countries. Here, his classmates talked about family holidays, food they had tried, and stories their grandparents had told them. George, your family travels quite a bit, doesn't it? Miss Thompson asked. Would you like to share anything about places you visited? George felt the familiar weight of choosing his words carefully. We've been to Australia, he said slowly, and Canada, and Scotland, of course. He didn't mention that these weren't family holidays, but official royal tours where he had met prime ministers and attended state functions. What was your favorite part about Australia? Amara asked, leaning forward with interest. George thought about the carefully orchestrated public appearances, the protocol meetings, and the constant presence of security personnel. But then he remembered one genuine moment of joy. I saw a kangaroo, he said with a small smile. A real one in the wild. It was amazing how they could hop so far with each jump. Did it have a baby in its pouch? Asked a girl named Emma from the next table. Yes, it did. A tiny one that was just learning to peek out at the world. As George described the experience, he found himself relaxing slightly. The memory was real, even if the circumstances of creating it were extraordinary. During morning break, George followed his classmates out to the playground, a vast expanse of concrete and grass that buzzed with activity. Children played football, jumped rope, and clustered in small groups, sharing snacks and stories. For someone accustomed to the formal gardens and carefully maintained grounds of royal residences, the cheerful chaos was both exhilarating and overwhelming. Oliver grabbed his arm excitedly. Come on, we're playing football. Do you want to join? George had played football before, but always with carefully selected partners and under the watchful eye of instructors who ensured he was never in any real danger of injury or failure. Here, the game was raw and competitive, with children diving for the ball and celebrating goals with uninhibited joy. I'm not very good, George admitted, though this was more modesty than truth. His private coaching had been excellent. That's okay, Oliver replied. Neither is James, but we still let him play. James, who had been quietly watching from the sidelines, gave a shy smile. I'm better at reading than running, he explained to George. But Oliver's right, they're nice about it. As the game progressed, George found himself caught up in the simple pleasure of chasing a ball across grass without worrying about photographers or protocol officers. When he scored a goal, his teammates cheered with genuine enthusiasm, and, for a moment, he forgot about everything except the satisfaction of contributing to his team's success. During lunch, the four table mates sat together in the canteen, comparing the contents of their lunchboxes. George opened his carefully prepared meal, trying to ignore the fact that each sandwich had been cut with mathematical precision and each piece of fruit selected for optimal nutrition. Your mom's very neat, Amara observed, looking at George's perfectly organized lunch. She likes things to be proper, George replied, which earned him understanding nods from his classmates. My mom just throws whatever's in the fridge into my lunchbox, Oliver laughed, revealing a slightly squashed sandwich and a banana that had seen better days. At least your mom packs your lunch, Emma called over from the next table. My dad always forgets, so I have to buy school dinners. George listened to his classmates' casual complaints about their parents with fascination. In his world, every detail of his life was managed by teams of people. The idea of a parent simply forgetting something or making a mistake seemed almost impossible to comprehend. What do your parents do for work? James asked, his quiet voice barely audible over the cafeteria noise. George felt his stomach tighten. This was the question he had been dreading. My father works in public service, he said carefully, and my mother supports various charities. Like my mom, Amara said, nodding. She works for a hospital charity. Says it's important to help people who need it. The afternoon brought art class, where Miss Thompson encouraged the children to paint pictures of their families. George stared at his blank paper for a long time, wondering how to represent his extraordinary family in a way that wouldn't raise questions. He painted a simple house with 4 figures standing in front, a tall man, a woman with long hair, and 2 children. He deliberately made the house modest and added a small garden with flowers. When Miss Thompson came by to admire his work, she smiled warmly. "That's a lovely family portrait, George. Is that your little sister?" "Yes, that's Charlotte," George replied, adding a final touch of yellow to represent her blonde hair. "And what about your baby brother?" Miss Thompson asked gently. George paused, realizing he had forgotten Louis entirely. In his anxiety to create a normal family portrait, he had unconsciously excluded the complexity of his real family situation. "Oh, he's too little to be in the picture yet," he improvised. As the school day drew to a close, George felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. He had survived his first day, made potential friends, and successfully navigated the basic social dynamics of primary school life. But he had also become acutely aware of how different his background was from his classmates, and how carefully he would need to guard that information. During the final lesson of the day, Miss Thompson announced that they would be starting a new project about local history. Each child would research and present information about an important historical figure or building in their area. "I'll assign partners tomorrow," she said, "and you'll have 2 weeks to prepare your presentations." George's mind immediately went to the wealth of historical information he had access to through his royal connections. Buckingham Palace alone contained archives that historians would kill to examine. But he realized that using such resources would be impossible without revealing his identity. As the children began packing up their belongings, Oliver turned to George with a grin. "Today was brilliant. I hope we're partners for the history project. I already have some great ideas about famous buildings around here." "What kind of buildings?" George asked, genuinely curious about his new friend's perspective on local history. "Well, there's this amazing palace not far from here," Oliver said excitedly. "Kensington Palace. It's where loads of kings and queens used to live. Wouldn't it be incredible to research that?" George felt his blood run cold. Of all the topics Oliver could have suggested, he had chosen the one place in London that George knew more intimately than anywhere else. That's an interesting idea," he managed to say. "I've always wondered what it would be like to live in a palace," Amara added dreamily. "Can you imagine having your own room in a place like that? And all those servants to help you?" "It might not be as wonderful as you think," George said quietly, thinking about the isolation, the constant scrutiny, and the weight of expectation that came with palace life. "Are you kidding?" Oliver laughed. "It would be like being a prince or something. You'd never have to worry about anything again." As George packed his school bag and prepared to leave, he reflected on the irony of his situation. His classmates romanticized the very life that he was trying to escape, at least temporarily. They saw only the glamour and privilege, not understanding the burden of duty and the loneliness of growing up in the public eye. The school bell rang, signaling the end of the day. Children burst from classrooms like water breaking through a dam, eager to share their daily adventures with waiting parents. George gathered his belongings slowly, savoring these last moments of being simply George Wales before returning to the reality of his royal identity. As he walked toward the school entrance where his parents would be waiting, George realized that this first day had been both easier and harder than he had expected. Easier because children, he had discovered, were remarkably accepting and focused on their own concerns. Harder because maintaining his secret identity would require constant vigilance and creativity. But as he saw Oliver wave goodbye and promise to save him a seat tomorrow, George felt something he had never experienced before. The pure joy of earning friendship through his own efforts rather than inheriting respect through his royal title. It was a feeling worth protecting, even if it meant living a carefully constructed double life. 3 weeks into the term, George had settled into a routine that felt almost normal. Each morning, he would wake in his palace bedroom, transform into George Wales with a school uniform, and spend the day navigating the wonderfully chaotic world of primary school. But maintaining his double identity was proving more challenging than anyone had anticipated. The friendship with Oliver, Amara, and James had deepened naturally. They saved seats for each other at lunch, partnered together for classroom activities, and had developed the kind of easy camaraderie that George had only read about in books. But with friendship came questions, and with questions came the increasingly difficult task of explaining his life without revealing the truth. "My mom wants to invite you for a play date this weekend," Oliver announced during morning break, his face bright with excitement. "She says she's curious to meet my new best friend." George felt his stomach drop. The simple invitation that would thrill any normal 8-year-old presented him with an impossible dilemma. How could he explain that playdates required security clearances, background checks, and advance teams? How could he visit Oliver's house when his every movement outside the palace needed to be carefully coordinated? "That sounds really nice," George replied carefully, "but weekends are usually quite busy for my family." "Doing what?" Amara asked, genuinely curious. "Do you have lots of family visits or something?" "Something like that," George murmured, hating himself for the half-truth. In reality, his weekends were filled with official engagements, royal functions, and the kind of formal events that constituted his training for future kingship. Miss Thompson had paired them for the local history project, and, true to his prediction, Oliver had chosen Kensington Palace as their subject. George found himself in the surreal position of researching his own home while pretending to know nothing more than what could be found in library books and tourist websites. "I found some amazing facts about the palace," Oliver whispered excitedly during their research session. "Did you know that Princess Diana used to live there? And now Prince William and his family live there too. Can you imagine what it must be like for those kids, growing up in a place like that?" George bent his head over the history book they were sharing, hoping Oliver wouldn't notice his flushed cheeks. "I suppose it will be quite different from how we live," he managed. "Different is right," James added softly. "I read that Prince George is about our age. Do you think he goes to a normal school like us?" The irony was so overwhelming that George had to bite his lip to keep from either laughing or confessing everything. I don't know," he stammered. "I haven't really thought about it." "I bet he doesn't," Amara declared with certainty. "Rich kids probably have private tutors and stuff. He's probably never even been in a real classroom with normal children." Each word felt like a small dagger to George's heart. His friends weren't being cruel. They were simply expressing assumptions based on their understanding of wealth and privilege. But they were also unconsciously describing the isolation and separation that George was working so hard to overcome. Their teacher, Miss Thompson, had been observing George carefully over the past few weeks. She had noticed his exceptional knowledge in certain subjects, his unusually formal vocabulary, and, most tellingly, his careful avoidance of personal details. During lunch duty one day, she had watched him eat with a methodical precision of someone trained in proper etiquette, and she had begun to suspect that George Wales was not quite who he claimed to be. "George, could you stay behind for a few minutes after class?" Miss Thompson asked one afternoon. "I'd like to discuss your project work." George's friends waved goodbye as they headed for the playground, leaving him alone with his teacher. The classroom felt different when empty, larger somehow, and more intimidating. Miss Thompson sat on the edge of her desk rather than behind it, creating a more casual atmosphere. "You're settling in well," she began, her voice kind but observant. "Your classmates clearly enjoy your company, and you're academically very strong. But I've noticed you seem uncomfortable whenever conversations turn to family or home life." George's royal training kicked in automatically. "I'm just quite private about personal things," he replied politely. Miss Thompson nodded understanding. "That's perfectly normal for some children. But I want you to know that if there's anything troubling you at home, or if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." "Thank you, Miss Thompson. That's very kind, but everything is fine at home." "I'm sure it is," she replied, though something in her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "You have a very formal way of speaking, George. Much more so than most children your age. Have you had a lot of adult company in your life?" The question was perceptive and dangerous. "My parents believe in proper manners," George replied, which was true even if it vastly understated the reality of his upbringing. Of course. Well, just remember that being 8 years old means you're allowed to be 8 years old. Sometimes I think you carry yourself like someone much older. That evening, George sat with his parents in their private dining room at Kensington Palace, recounting his day with careful editing. He told them about Oliver's playdate invitation and watched his parents exchange the kind of meaningful look that passed between them whenever his school life collided with royal realities. "We could arrange something," Catherine said thoughtfully. "Perhaps Oliver could come here instead?" "To the palace?" George asked, imagining his friend's reaction to discovering the truth. Wouldn't that raise questions? William set down his fork and looked at his son seriously. "George, you can't live two completely separate lives forever. At some point, your school friends will need to know who you really are." "But what if they don't want to be friends with a prince?" George asked, voicing his deepest fear. "What if they only pretend to like me because they have to?" "Then they wouldn't be real friends," Catherine replied gently. "True friends care about who you are inside, not what title you carry." "But how can I tell the difference?" George pressed. "How will I know if someone